I don't know about you, but I'm always in a bit of a dilemma, if you would, with Good Friday. I know how to feel about Good Sunday, or Easter Sunday, Resurrection Sunday. My emotions are kind of lined up with my head and my heart, like it all kind of works for Easter Sunday. But it doesn't always work for me as well on a day like today. We call it Good Friday. And yet I wake up every Good Friday with the same feeling, that because my head tells me what occurred 2,000 years ago on this day, and it was anything but good. And yet it was necessary. And yet because it was necessary, its necessity is what makes it good. And yet when we know what occurred, it leaves me brokenhearted. It leaves me sad. How can something so good make you feel so sad? I'm going to invite you to stand. That's a question that I want you to kind of discuss with those who are around and you're in the circle to where you've been come to sit today. Discuss it with your family and friends. How can you feel good, or do you feel sad on Good Friday, and why? And we'll be back in just a minute. Well, I don't know if you got it all straightened out or not. I know I've been, I guess, my whole life been in church for Good Friday services and still haven't got it all figured out. Good, sad, happy, whatever it is, it's all about the story. This series, this book that we read from hopefully day after day, this book that tells the story of God's plan for creation. On this day, we call it good, and as I said, it's always in the forefront of my mind as I prepare for this day. So much of our community is celebrating. They're having fun. They're getting together. You're getting together with family, and you're feasting with your friends. You're enjoying some time off. And I mean, who wouldn't deny that that's not good, having some time off with family and friends? But for all the good, there's this moment that feels at times anything but good. I feel sad. When my heart thinks of what they did to my Savior, when I see the portrayals of the crucifixion, there's this heaviness in my chest, and I find myself with tears welling up, and there are moments that I fear that if I start crying, I don't know if I'm going to be able to stop. But it's good. Good stories have good endings, don't they? Good stories have emotional endings. They make us cheer. They make us smile. They give us pause for hope and for encouragement. Sometimes you come to the end of a story, and the good ones do make us cry. I had a conversation this week with a devout Jewish woman, Orthodox Jew, and was asking about their Passover celebrations. We were in a meeting, and I was wishing her a happy Passover, or wishing her well on her family celebrations. And so we were able to dialogue back and forth a little bit about what their week-long celebrations and festivities were like for their family. For the entire week, they gather every evening. They sit around their kitchen tables, their dining room tables, their living rooms, and there are all kinds of activities for both the kids and the parents and everyone who is involved. And I found it interesting that central to the night, as they gather together as families and extended family for all of the evenings of Passover, central to the night, the story is told. They tell the story of Abraham, and of Isaac, of Jacob. They tell the story of Joseph and the move into Israel. They tell the story of Moses, the plagues, the Exodus. And as I'm listening to her share these stories, as I'm listening to not just the words, but the tone in her voice, the endearment in her voice, she speaks words like salvation, forgiveness, sacrifice. She uses words like redemption and hope and faith. And without any sense of condemnation or judgment, I listened to her and I found it a little bit sad that how could someone have so much of the story but miss out on the climax? It's like sitting at home and watching a movie. And you're watching it and you have to maybe excuse yourself to go to the washroom and your wife doesn't press pause. And you find yourself saying, what happened? And she won't rewind it to go back and tell the story. How can you read a story and not find out what happens? Or to miss out on the hows and the whys and the conclusion, if you would. Folks, we've been telling the story. God has been telling the story for thousands of years. And I want you to know that Easter is the point of the story. The biblical narrative is God's story of redemption, bringing mankind back into relationship with himself through the death and resurrection of his Son, Jesus Christ. And it is central to all that we hold to be sacred and true and valuable and powerful and transformative for our lives. It moves us from death to life, from slavery to freedom, from victim to victor, from religion to relationship, from evil to good. Easter is his story. It's his passion. It's his passion for us, and that's the week that they call it. That's what we have been in this whole week long. It's called the Passion Week. All other events either point to or lead from this event when you look through Holy Scriptures. Go back to the very beginning in Genesis chapter 3:15. God predicted that the seed of the woman, which was Jesus, would bruise the head of the serpent, Satan. It was a foreshadowing of the death and the resurrection of Christ. Years later, the prophets foretold the passion in more vivid detail, describing the Lord as a sacrificial lamb in the book of Isaiah and other prophets. Jesus comes on the scene, and during his 3 years of ministry, he explains that his death was the very purpose for him coming to earth in the first place. He calls his followers in Luke chapter 9 to take up their crosses daily in sacrificial service to him. And years later, after the death and the resurrection of Christ, the apostles echo this call when they describe the crucified life to the hearers. Paul says in Galatians that I've been crucified with Christ. It's not any longer that I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. And today, 2,000 years later, we gather together in churches just like this, and we describe the living, the crucified life as an evidence of our faith and a measure of our surrender to him. So I'd like to, if I could, I'd like to read for you the story very simply today. You can just kind of close your eyes or just kind of listen as I tell you the story of the Passion of Christ. Jesus stood before the governor. Are you the king of the Jews? The governor asked him. Well, you've said it, Jesus said. And while he's being accused by the chief priests and the elders, he doesn't answer. He doesn't say a thing. Pilate says to him, don't you hear how much they're testifying against you? But he never answered him, not on one charge. Not so much that the governor was even amazed. At the festival, the governor's custom was to release to the crowd a prisoner that they wanted. And at that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they gathered together, Pilate said to them, who is it you want me to release for you? Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Messiah? For he knew that they handed him over because of envy. The chief priests and the elders, however, persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to execute Jesus. Well, which of the two do you want me to release to you? Barabbas, they answered. Pilate asked them, well, what should I do then with Jesus, who is called Messiah? Crucify him, they answered. Well, why? He's not done anything wrong. But the crowds wouldn't listen. They kept shouting, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere and that there was a riot that was now starting. So instead he took some water and he washed his hands in front of the crowd and he said, I'm innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. And all the people answered, "His blood shall be upon us, and let his blood be upon our children." And then he released Barabbas to them. And after having flogged Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. And then the governor's soldiers took him into headquarters, and they gathered the whole company around him. And they stripped him, and they dressed him in a scarlet robe, twisted together a crown of thorns, and they put it on his head. They placed a reed in his right hand. They knelt down before him. They mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spat at him, and they took a reed and they kept hitting him on the head with it. They mocked him, and they stripped him of his robe, and they led him away to be crucified. And as they were going out, they found a Cyrenian man named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. And when they came to the place called Golgotha, which means the skull place, they gave him wine mixed with gall to drink, but when he tasted it, he wouldn't drink it. After crucifying them, they divided his clothes by casting lots. They sat down and were guarding him there, and above his head they put up a charge against him in writing that said, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." And then two criminals, they were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those who passed by, they were yelling insults at him as well, shaking their hands and saying, "The one who would destroy or demolish the sanctuary and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross." The same way the chief priests with the scribes and the elders, they mocked him. And they said, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe in him then. He's put his trust in God. Well, let God rescue him now if he wants him." "I am God's son," he said. In the same way that even criminals who were crucified, they also kept taunting him. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over the whole land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which is to mean, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some of those who were standing there heard this, and they said, "Well, he's calling for Elijah." One of them ran, got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and fixed it on a reed, and offered him to have a drink. But the rest of them said, "Well, no, let's see if Elijah comes to save him." Jesus shouted in a loud voice, and he gave up his spirit, and he died. Suddenly the curtain of the sanctuary was split in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split, and tombs were opened, and bodies of saints who had gone to the rest were raised from the dead. And they came out of their tombs after the resurrection, entered the holy city, and they appeared to many. And the centurion who was there, and those with him who were guarding Jesus, saw the earthquake and the things that had happened. They were absolutely terrified. This man truly was the Son of God. Many of the women who had followed Jesus from Galilee, those who had ministered to him, were there looking from a distance. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. Jesus was publicly scourged or beaten with leather-thonged whips that had tiny pieces of iron and bone that were tied to the ends of each of the leather thongs that would cut deeply and bruise him deeply as they struck against his body and his legs and his chest area. He was mocked and struck in the head with a staff, and they would spit on him. A crown of thorns was placed on his head that was pierced down into his skull. He was stripped of his clothing. He was led to Golgotha where he'd be crucified, and as was the custom, they nailed him to the cross. They gave him a mixture of vinegar and wine that was offered to him to alleviate some of the suffering, but Jesus refused to drink it. They took long stake-like nails and they drove them into his wrists and his ankles, and they fastened him to the cross with these nails where he was crucified between two convicted criminals. The inscription tauntingly said, "This is the King of the Jews," and on the cross, Jesus hangs for his final hours, the final agonizing breaths. During that time, soldiers, they cast lots for Jesus' clothing while people passed by shouting and scoffing at him. We know that from the cross and other parts of the story, Jesus speaks to his mother Mary and he speaks to his disciples. We know that at one point he cries out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" And a little bit later, darkness covers the earth. As Jesus passes from this earth into death, he gives up his spirit. The earthquake happens, and the ground is shook, and the temple veil that is in there is split in half, and rocks begin to split, and graves are opened. At the end, it was typical for crucifixions for Roman soldiers to show mercy by breaking the legs of criminals so that they could not shove up and breathe anymore, and so they would quickly die of asphyxiation. Instead, one soldier takes a sword and he pierces his side to ensure of his death. And after his passing and before sunset, Jesus is taken down, and a man by the name of Joseph of Arimathea, who's wealthy, has a tomb that Jesus couldn't even afford, and he gives him his tomb, and there he is laid to rest. And we call it Good Friday. We believe that the death of Jesus Christ provided the perfect atoning sacrifice for the sins of all mankind, thus making the crucifix or the cross one of the most defining symbols of Christianity. And although both Roman and Jewish leaders could very well be implicated in the sentencing of and the death of Jesus, he says to himself, he says to those who are there, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. For I have the authority to lay down my life, and I have the authority to take my life up again." The curtain of the veil of the temple is separating the Holy of Holies from mankind. Only once a year could a priest ever go in there to make sacrifices of sins for the people. But when Christ dies, the veil is torn in half, symbolizing the destruction of the barrier between God and man. The way was opened up through Christ's sacrifice on the cross. His death provides the complete sacrifice for sin, so now all people through Christ can approach the throne of grace freely. And we call that good. We move from death to life. And this is very good. The cross. It rests on the timeline of history like a compelling diamond. Its tragedy summons all sufferers. Its absurdity attracts all critics. Its hope lures all searchers. What an incredible piece of wood. History has idolized it, despised it, gold-plated it, burned it, worn it, and trashed it. History has done everything to it but ignore it. For that's the one option that the cross does not offer. You cannot ignore the cross. You can't ignore a piece of lumber that suspends the greatest claim in all of human history, a crucified carpenter claiming that he is God on earth. Its bottom line is sobering. If the account is true, then all of history has it for its hinge. If not, then it's history's greatest hoax. On that first Easter morning, the kingdom of death was repossessed and hope took up the payments. But even Easter has to start with a cross. Passion Week is full of so many other smaller stories within the context of the larger story, more stories than we would have time to tell. Consider just a couple. They force Simon to carry the cross. Simon was a common Jewish name. He was a local believer. He was not some pagan who was tricked into church by a potluck dinner. He was a common religious guy. He was a churchgoer. He knew that God would send a Messiah. And I thought that perhaps there may be some of you here today who feel like you're Simon, that you've been forced to the cross. Maybe you'd rather not be here today, or any day for that matter. Some of you are forced here today because of a feeling of a sense of family duty. You're here because family gathers together on Easter and you don't want to have half the family here and the other half sitting at home. A husband that feels obligated, a mother who comes only for her children, a family that comes just for the grandparents to keep grandma and grandpa happy. At least it makes for a nice tradition. There's a lesson that we all need to learn here today. Simon was the only person besides Christ who was closest to this cross. He carried it, but he was never changed by it. That timber of God's love was on his very back, but never in the rest of the New Testament do we ever hear of his conversion. Never do we see him run home and tell his wife that he carried the cross for God. Be reminded today, every one of us, be reminded today, you can be close to the cross, but you can be far from Christ. We also see the soldiers, the crowd, the religious leaders. In one or another, one way or another, they all touched the cross, but they never let the cross touch them. Some people are silent and some people are loud at their opposition to the cross. People are very vocal about the cross sometimes. Others just don't want to mention it at all, like the soldiers that played games at the foot of the cross. We see that some of the people that were there in their own narrative, they spit on Jesus, it says. To the Jews, the spit of a non-Jew was to make them unclean. You have to understand that it was one of the most horrific things that could have been done to Jesus was the act of spitting upon him, because it never gave him the chance to be ceremonially clean before his death, thus leaving him to be humiliated and unacceptable before Yahweh in the afterlife once he passed. The religious leaders, they hurled insults and they quoted his own words at them. Their own education and pride would not allow God to die on the cross for them. They did not understand, as Paul the great learned one said, that the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God unto salvation. To those of you who feel forced to be here today, for those of you who are pondering this message and whether or not you just are close to a cross, or whether to be close to a Christ, I challenge you to consider all that he did and all that he does. And then there's the criminal. That one criminal hangs near to the cross in repentance and humility. He deserves hell, but he gets heaven. That's you and me. That's those of us who are here today who believe by faith. We don't know if this criminal ever heard Messiah speak. We don't know if he was ever around during the Beatitudes. We don't know if this criminal had any knowledge of the miracles or the healing. We don't know that we'd ever see him show love to the lowly, the immoral, or the despised. We have no understanding of that at all. We can only wonder if he just saw what he sees now and what the centurion saw. It caused him to say, surely this really was the Son of God. As Max Lucado writes, like a master painter, God reserved his masterpiece until the end. All the earlier acts of love since the beginning of time have been leading up to this one. God unveils the canvas in the ultimate act of creative compassion, and it is revealed God on a cross. The Creator being sacrificed for the creation. God convincing man that once and for all, that to be forgiven still follows failure. If a picture paints 1,000 words, then the centurion and the thief, they got a dictionary full. As the team comes up, let me close with this one story. It's a story of a father and his son. Mom had died in her early years, and as a result, the father and his son, they were family to one another, and they were very close. The boy grew up to be a young man, and consequently he was drafted into a war during those days. The father was always distressed that his son was going off to war, but his heart was broken and lonely. A few years passed, and one day the father got word that the son had been killed in combat. Grief-stricken, he mourned for month after month until finally, within a few months, a knock came on the door. It was a young man, and he was missing one of his arms. But beneath his good arm was a photo wrapped in brown paper. The young man spoke and said, "Sir, you don't know who I am, but I wanted you to know that I knew your son. He saved my life. During one battle, he took the bullet so that I would not have to. Your son meant so much to me that I painted this picture of your son, and I want you to have it today." The soldier handed the picture to the proud father, and as the father unwrapped it, he opened it up to see that it was a very poorly painted picture of his son. Now the father, he was a very wealthy man, and he collected fine art. And on one of his walls hung many Picassos and Van Gogh paintings. The father took the picture of his son, and he moved some of the other Picassos around, and he placed the picture of his son right in the middle. And year after year, he admired that picture. Well, as time goes on, the father grows weak and old, and he dies. And there was to be an auction at the house, and people from all over the world knew about this man's estate auction, and they came to bid on the Picassos and the Van Goghs. As the auctioneer began to start the auction, he pulls and places before in the easel board the picture of this young man, and only to be met with groans across the room as people mumbled to themselves, and some even spoke out and said, "Oh, why are you starting with this? Get on with this picture. Take it away, and let's start with the good stuff." The auctioneer ignored him. And he begins by saying, "Who will give me a first bid for this painting of the man's son?" No one said anything. $1? Will somebody give me $1 or $2 for the picture? Silence. In a moment, from the back, the old gardener who'd been taking care of the property for many, many years, he walks up and he asks the auctioneer if he could buy it. He had $1. He could pay for that. See, he had known the boy his whole life, and he'd grew up, and he knew what a fine young man he was, and he knew the love between the father and his son. And so for $1, the gardener bought the picture, and he began to walk down the aisle with the picture tucked underneath his arms, and he gets halfway back down the aisle. The auctioneer takes them out, and he slams it down and says, "Folks, the auction is over." For in the man's will, it read, "Whoever has the Son gets it all." As we approach the communion table, as we partake of the emblems and hold in our hands the bread, a symbol of the body of God's Son, we hold the juice, a symbol of God's Son, His blood. I want you to know that if you get this picture, you get it all. If you hold the Son, you hold everything else. As they distribute, please hold them, these emblems, and we'll share together. As I reflect on my time talking with that Jewish lady about the celebration of their traditions of Passover, in preparation for today, I thought about ours. The traditions that we hold central to our faith. I don't know of another one more profound than communion. Do you understand the emblems that you hold in your hand today? The practice you're about to partake was first initiated by Jesus Himself. On the evening of His betrayal, He told the disciples, and He told all of us down through the ages, do this often. Remember me. Remember that I'm coming back. And the thought occurred to me, what about the year after? What about the first Passover? All of the disciples would have been Jews. What about the first Passover after Christ's death and resurrection? It would have been the year anniversary. Peter and the apostles, they would have all gotten back together again. They might have even gone back to that same place. I can imagine them sitting around and telling the stories. They would share the stories, some with tears, some with joy, some very sad, some very happy. They would recount the words that He spoke as He walked as a Galilean along the waters, the miracles. They would tell the story of that night of Gethsemane, of the betrayal. Tears would roll down their faces as they account the crucifixion. That first night that Peter would have held the piece of bread up and said, remember guys, he told us to do this. And on the anniversary, the eve of his death, let's break this bread. And he tore the bread. And he said, guys, let's eat it like he told us to. Let's eat it and let's remember. Let's remember his broken body. Let's remember what he went through. They'd eat for a while. Peter would take a big goblet, probably made of clay, filled with wine. And he'd say, remember when he held this? Remember when he held this and the tears was coming down his face and he said, this is my blood which is going to be poured for you. We didn't understand what he was saying, but we understand now. And he said, drink. And when you drink, you rejoice. When you drink, you remember. When you partake, you remember my death until I come again. And that's good. That's very good. Amen.